Hello and welcome to the VBridger 2024, I know it's 2025 now, but it's 2024, tutorial part 5, tongues. Tongues are stupid and nobody likes rigging them. This method just makes it possible to make tongues work with all VBridger shapes. The tongue isn't a necessary part of VBridger because it's still an absolute pain to rig. A model doesn't need the tongue to be a VBridger model. So if you're going to offer the tongue on commissions or something following this tutorial, please consider it an addition rather than a baseline requirement. To start, we're going to go over the simplest possible tongue to make, which is one layer. Any additional layers will be covered at the end of this video because they all use the same process and we can copy a lot of the work that we do for our first layer to our other layers, which will make your life easier. So think of extra layers as extra steps, but it doesn't change much. So, the layers for the simplest tongue. We have a TongueOut layer, a TongueOut tip line layer, and the TongueOut tip layer. The line sits behind the tongue tip, so it just becomes a line for the tip, and the tip is just a copy of TongueOut but cut wherever it comes out of the mouth. You can think of it as if your character bit off their tongue, the tongue tip is the piece that they bit off. Make sure that the cut is as flat as possible, like literally use a rectangle selection box and just delete the top bit. It's really important that this is flat for later. If you are doing a multi-layer tongue, you need a few more layers than the simplest tongue, of course. The important thing to note is that if you are using masks for shadows and highlights, your masks need to be inverse masks. And because they're inverse masks, you need to fill the TongueOut tip mask instead of cutting it like you cut the tongue layer itself. All the other copies for the tip should be full, so don't cut the shadow layer, don't cut the highlight layer, leave those as full copies. You could probably get away with just making the inverse mask for the tip and then making a copy of all of your tongue base layers and using the mask to make the tip instead of actually making the tip layer. I just like to have things named a little bit, so I'm having the duplicates in the PSD instead of making copies in Live 2D, but you could if you wanted to be more efficient. I'm going to make this tutorial from the perspective of you having already finished a model. So I'm importing the tongue out and we'll run through the entire process of masking it and adding it to the model. Assuming that you followed the other parts of this tutorial, it should work pretty well. If you're a little bit lost on some of the masks that I already have, I'll explain them a little bit, but if you want the in-depth breakdown, go check the other parts of this tutorial series. So here I am, having freshly added my layers to my model. They are outside of my normal model folders, and they are nowhere in the hierarchy. They do not have a mesh, and they must be meshed. Grab all 3 of your tongue layers and start selecting it from TongueOut, then TongueOut tip line, then TongueOut tip. So from bottom to top, this is so that when we are meshing it, they display in the correct order. If you are doing your multiple layered tongue, only mesh these 3 base layers that you share with the simple tongue. We will worry about the other layers later. You can literally delete them for now or hide them, but we won't be using the imported layers at all, so I recommend deleting all of your extra layers to start. In order to start meshing, we're going to delete the original box meshes, and then we are going to go into Show Model Image mode. This gives us a slightly transparent box around each of our layers, which we will be using to help us mesh. Using the poly pen, I'm going to add a line with the first vertice starting on the corner of that upper transparent box. And the second vertice of the poly pen will be right on the line where the second box starts. Then I will switch the mesh from a width of 2 to a width of 1, so we just have a poly line. And I'll add a bit more density to it, so I have a few vertices going from the back of the tongue to the middle of the tongue. Then I will confirm the line and start a new line at the bottom of both boxes to right next to the last line that I made. I'll confirm the stroke and then delete the last vertice and connect my old line to my new line. I make sure to delete them on both sides because I am in mirror mode, and it won't delete the one on the other side if I only delete the one on the left side. This ensures that I have perfectly spaced vertices for the back of the tongue and the tip of the tongue. It's very important that the vertices are evenly spaced because when we are gluing, it will save us so much time and energy to make sure that the tongue stays looking the way that the art does. You'll understand why when we get to the gluing. For now, connect all of the vertices horizontally. So just go from left to right to left to right to left to right and make sure that they are all connected. Then we will add vertices along the middle of the tongue vertically. The edge of the mesh is too close to the art right now, so I'm going to move it down a bit. It's okay to expand the mesh a little bit on the top and bottom, as long as the rest of the vertices are evenly spaced. A little bit of deviation is fine. Next, we will cut around the tongue, only creating vertices on those horizontal lines that we've already set up. I always start with defining the outer edge of the mesh. So there's a ring of vertices around the outside of the art and a ring of vertices around the inside of the art. Next, we want to go to the mesh along the tongue line and add enough horizontal definition that we'll be able to deform the tongue pretty easily. And we will vertically connect those horizontal vertices to the rest of the mesh, adding as we go. Then delete the outermost vertices, we no longer need them. Hit the check mark to complete your edit of these meshes, then select just the TongueOut tip line, and we will mesh around the art using our existing mesh scaffold and delete the upper and lower mesh that has no art in it. With that, our meshing is done. Next, we will be creating the tongue parameters. So I'm going to create a new folder and call it tongue. The first parameter we create will be called TongueOut, and I'll leave the ID as param TongueOut. The minimum value should be 0, and the default value should be 0, and the maximum value should be 1. Our next parameter will be a blend shape, so I'm checking the blend shape box. I will call it tongue_glue_BL. This parameter will help us glue things correctly. Then we will create another new parameter and we will call it tongue_reset. This is our reset parameter so that all of our deformers and meshes can return to their original positions if we need them to. Also very useful for gluing. And lastly, I will create the tongue physics. So I'm going to call it tongue_phys_x_1. It will be a blend shape with a minimum of -1 and a maximum of 1, default of 0. And I'll duplicate that a couple times to create 2 x parameters and 2 y parameters. You could probably use more than 2 parameters, I just think 2 is generally enough. All of our parameters are created now, so it's time to get into the glue. Before we glue anything, we are going to select the TongueOut tip and copy it and paste it to create a duplicate. We will reposition the duplicate to be under the TongueOut_tip. We will name this duplicate TongueOut tip_lips because this is going to be where our lips are eventually. Before we get into the glue, we are going to add some keys to our tongue layers. This will make gluing a lot easier. With all your tongue layers except the line selected, first add keys to the tongue reset parameter. Then select TongueOut and flatten it upwards. Then select your TongueOut tip lips and move the box by holding X while moving it to where the top of the layer ends, and then scale it down from there by holding Alt. Then grab your TongueOut tip layer and flatten it downwards. When you activate the tongue reset parameter now, it should just go back and forth between our sandwich tongue and our regular tongue. Next we will add keys to the tongue glue BL parameter, And for this one, we just scale down horizontally until the tongue is flat as a pancake. When these two are activated together, we can have the tongue in regular position and flattened, or the tongue in sandwich position and flattened as well. Next, we will be gluing the tongue, so make sure that you select these meshes in the same order that I am from the same menu that I am. I am selecting them from the part menu. It's important that you select them from here because Live2D doesn't always like to glue correctly when you select them from the other menu. So first we will select the TongueOut tip lips and then the TongueOut and glue those together. Now when I activate the reset parameter, the glue is averaging the mesh between the back of the tongue and the tongue at the lips. What we want is for the back of the tongue to stay at the back of the tongue and for the middle of the tongue to stay at the lips. Right now the whole mesh is in between the two, so we need to paint the mesh so that the back stays at the back and the middle stays at the middle. This is where it's very helpful to have that glue parameter and the reset parameter. By activating the glue parameter, we smoosh all the vertices next to each other so that we can evenly apply the glue. And the tongue reset parameter tells us whether or not we are doing a good job. For the back tongue glue, the entire tip should be red, and then the middle to the back should fade from red to blue. When the tongue reset parameter is at 0, the back of the tongue should look about the same as when the tongue reset parameter is at 1. Since our mesh is perfectly spaced vertically, the other way to think about this would be that the mesh should always stay evenly spaced vertically. This means that when we are working on the glue, we just need to make sure that all of the vertices stay equally distant from each other. So we don't even need to see the tongue, we can just activate the glue parameter and adjust all of these vertices all at once, and as long as they are equally distant from each other, the tongue will stay proportionally the same. This means that your art won't be doing weird warpy shit when you're activating the glue. It's fine if it looks like it scales up a little bit or down a little bit, that's okay as long as the vertices are equidistant. Once the back of the tongue is looking correct, it is time to glue the TongueOut tip lips to the TongueOut tip. Now we just need to adjust the glue the same way that we did for the back of the tongue. This time the entire back of the tongue should be red, and then from the middle of the tongue to the tip of the tongue, we should blend from red to blue. If you have a vertice perfectly between the middle of your tongue and the tip of your tongue, just make sure that that vertice is yellow. That means that it'll be perfectly 50-50 between the tongue at the lips and the tongue at the tip, and then you can balance the other vertices around that middle point. Just makes life a little bit easier. If you want to return the 50-50 glue weight to any points, you just need to select the yellow tool, hold shift, and go over those points. This will separate them from being glued to each other, and once they're fully separated, and you use the yellow tool again while not holding shift, it'll bring them together with perfect half and half weighting. If some turn red or some turn blue, it just means that they weren't fully separated when you tried to reconnect them. With that middle line perfectly weighted to the middle, we see it barely moves at all when we use the tongue reset, and then we can just reposition those other lines of verts until it is perfectly spaced. By managing our mesh this way, we are doing 1/10 of the work for gluing it than if we hadn't. If we had just meshed like the normal meshing way, we'd have to go to each individual vertice and make sure that it didn't move inappropriately, which would be a lot of work, and we don't like work here. With the glue parameter on, we can just slide between the tongue reset positions and see how much the verts are moving, and we just need to make sure that they don't move very much. While the TongueOut reset parameter is at 0, if I drag the glue compatibility of the TongueOut tip and TongueOut tip lips glue to 0, you can see that one of our tongue tip meshes is going in and out from the lips. That is the TongueOut tip lips layer. So we're going to turn the opacity of the TongueOut tip layer to 0. Then with the glue selected, I'm going to the TongueOut parameter, and I'm going to key the glue and animate the glue compatibility. So when the TongueOut is 0, the compatibility is 0, and when the TongueOut is 1, the compatibility is 100. While animating the tongue, it will be annoying if the tongue keeps resetting every time we reset our parameter defaults. So I'm going to set the default value of TongueOut to 1, just so the tongue's always sticking out when we key it. Now when I drag TongueOut between 1 and 0, the tongue should just be sticking out and sticking in again and sticking out and sticking in again. And resetting the parameter sets the TongueOut back to 1. The meshes and the glue are ready, so it is time to integrate these layers into the model so we can actually rig it. The majority of the tongue will be between the upper and lower lips. I have mine in folders, so it's very convenient to just stick the tongue there. The base layers of the tongue, however, need to be under the upper teeth. Then we need to apply the masks so that the tongue actually sits inside the mouth correctly. The TongueOut tip lips and the TongueOut tip lines needs to be masked by the upper lip mask. This is an inverse mask that I set up in a previous part of this tutorial. So I'm just selecting the mask layer and hitting Ctrl+C. Then when I select the TongueOut tip lips and the TongueOut tip line layers, I can go into the clipping ID and paste the ID of the mask for the top lip. And of course check the inverse mask box as well. The TongueOut tip line also needs to be inverse masked by the upper teeth inverse mask that I also created earlier in this tutorial. It's just a layer that has been filled and had the teeth selected and deleted out of it. So it is the exact opposite of my upper teeth layer. And when this is applied to the tongue line, it will make the tongue line only appear when it is in front or on top of the upper teeth. So you don't always have a line going across your tongue. Lastly, we need to glue the TongueOut base layer. We will just copy the masks from the upper teeth and apply those to the TongueOut layer as well. Now the inner tongue stays under the top teeth but in front of the bottom teeth. The tongue tip stays outside of the mouth but under the upper lip. And the tongue line only appears when it is in front of the top teeth. Altogether, this looks like a tongue probably should. We can also control the back of the tongue and the tongue where it is on top of the lips and the tip of the tongue separately, while keeping the tongue as one tongue. These meshes need deformers in order to be controlled, so we are going to add deformers now. I will add the first deformer to the TongueOut tip lips and the TongueOut tip line, and I will call it TongueOut_lips. Then I'll select the TongueOut_tip mesh and create a new deformer called TongueOut_tip. Next is the TongueOut layer. I re-recorded this tutorial a few times. I don't know why I named it TongueOut_tip_back. It should just be TongueOut_back, but I didn't fix this. Make sure you add reset keys to all of the tongue deformers. Moving along, next we need to sort these deformers into the models deformers. So first I'm going to find where all of my lip lines are, and then I will put the TongueOut lips deformer in that same parent deformer, so it's with the rest of the lips. Then I will take the TongueOut back deformer and stick that with our already animated tongue. So it's in the same parent deformer as our old inner mouth tongue. While we are editing the back tongue, we're also going to make our TongueOut tongue match our current inner tongue. So I'm going to select both tongues and hit S to solo them, and then I will move the deformer so that our TongueOut is roughly the same shape as our inner tongue. I will also increase the vertical deformer division so that it moves with our original tongue a little bit better. For the tongue tip, we need different XY animation than we currently have. We already have XY animation for the inner mouth, we have it for the lips, but the tip of the tongue is a different level than the rest of the face. So we need new deformers for it. And instead of doing the work and creating new deformers from scratch, we're just going to copy the current mouth hierarchy, and then we are just going to adjust it a little bit. So select all of the mouth deformers, then copy, and in the TongueOut folder we will paste. All of our copies have a 2 at the end of the name. We're going to replace the 2 with tongue tip. This will keep the project organized. We don't want a bunch of numbers, we want things actually describing what they're doing. Then grab your TongueOut tip deformer and stick that in the childmost deformer of the copies you just made. Now we have a copy of everything that the mouth is doing, except now we can just pull the tip of the tongue out of the face a little bit more. This is also why I recommend leaving the tongue out to the very end of any model. Trying to do it in the middle means that you're doing a bunch of work twice when you could just copy it when you're done the rest of the face. At this point, the tongue should be moving along with the head. It'll be ugly, but it's moving along with it, and that's the important part. If anything is moving wildly different than the rest of your face, you've put a deformer in the wrong spot. It is now time to animate the VBridger parameters for the tongue. Select the bottom lip line, the TongueOut lips, and all of our tongue tip layers, and then hit S to isolate them. Our TongueOut lips deformer needs to be animated with the lips, so we're going to use the same method that we used in the mouth rigging tutorial. We'll start with mouth open, then mouth funnel, then mouth form, then mouth press lip open, and finally the pucker widen blend shape. We essentially want the tongue and the tongue line to stay touching the lower lip line as close as possible while staying above the lip line and never crossing it. If your tongue line ever crosses your lower lip line, you will have your tongue break. I forgot to include isolating the tip, so I'm going to select all of the layers I currently have visible and the tongue tip deformer so I can animate the tongue tip as well. It's a little bit unconventional, but by using these two deformers we can animate the shape of the tongue pretty well. We want to make sure that the tongue tip moves along with the tongue at the lips, so it stays the same length. After mouth open looks good, we need to key mouth funnel. For mouth funnel, the tongue should get a lot skinnier, and the tip should get skinnier with it, otherwise you end up with like a balloon tongue that looks kind of weird. Mouth funnel also happens when the mouth is closed, so I'll combine the parameters and make sure that the tongue continues to move with the bottom lip and never crosses over the bottom lip line. So carefully check all of your transitions. Make sure that the tongue line never crosses over the bottom lip line. I'm going to repeat it a lot. Even Happy agrees. While we never want the tongue line to cross the lip line, we also don't want it to separate too much from the lip line. If the tongue line stays too far above the lip line, then you end up with gaps that you don't want to have. The tongue should also stay relatively low in the mouth. If your tongue is really high up and close to the mouth corners, you're probably going to run into problems when you have to do the head angles. That's why my tongue is skinnier than my lips. It should be smaller than the lips so that it can cross over lower in the mouth when the mouth opens, and you don't have to move it too much, causing transition issues between keys. After funnel, we do form, so I will add keys to form, and then I will just make the tongue smile with the smile and frown with the frown. If you make the tongue lips deformer too curved, you can run into two types of problems where the mesh will fold over itself to reach the tip when you do the head angles or mouth X. So try to keep it as flat as you can while following the lower lip line. I'll leave a little bit of a time lapse here as I'm just checking all of the transitions and making tiny adjustments. It's pretty straightforward because we're animating the tongue based on what we've already done for the mouth, so if you spent a lot of time making your mouth nice, adding the tongue is very easy. Or if not easy, at least it's straightforward. I'm going to vanish for about a minute as I let the time lapse play. Once the mouth form is done, it is time to key mouth press lip open. For lip open, we still want the tongue to touch the edges of the lip, but we want to keep the center of the tongue higher so it covers the top teeth. Just a little bit. Press is the same as all the other mouth closed shapes, we just want it to follow the lower lip. Then, to save ourselves some time, we are going to combine the mouth press lip open shape and the mouth form shape while the mouth is closed. This will give us a really solid basis for our form edits, so we don't have to redo all of the form deformation that we did, and we can just adjust the shapes a little bit now and it'll look great. Once mouth closed is done, we do mouth open. I made a small oversight while recording this. I didn't move the tongue tip with press lip open, I was only focusing on the tongue at the lips. So make sure you move your tip as well. I do it later when I notice that I missed it, but do it all at once. It makes your life easier. Going back is annoying. I still have both selected, so I still have keys on both of them, so it's going to be more annoying for me to add the tip later. As always, check all of the transitions, make sure that that tongue line never crosses the lower lip line, and you'll be golden. Keep going back and tweaking anything that needs to be changed until everything looks very smooth. Once you think you're done, hit S again to unsolo everything, and now you can see what the tongue looks like with all of the masks active. So the tongue line should disappear unless you can see that the tongue tip is crossing over the upper teeth, and otherwise the tongue should look pretty normal. It should follow our mouth movements and look like a tongue. Even after re-recording this tutorial 3 times, I still forgot to add the mouth pucker widen blend shape until way later when I was doing tracking and I realized it was missing. So I'm sticking that part of the recording here because this is where you're supposed to do it. But I did forget. So if it's not in the rest of the video until like way later, that's why. Adding more keys to the tongue lips deformer will give you a little warning / error / don't do this message. Ignore it. If you don't exactly follow the lip on mouth pucker, you will end up with gaps and stuff in the rest of your shapes. So get the deformation as exact as you can, moving with the lower lips. If there's any amount of sliding, you will end up with gaps on your tongue and lips. Assuming that you did your pucker widen the same way I did and didn't just use the deformer. Just using the deformer is a lot easier and means that you don't even have to do this step. But if you were following the way that I did it in the mouth tutorial, then we also need to add a blend shape weight control. So we want to add the mouth open and with a line 3 so that it turns off when the mouth is open. Why do you disagree, Happy? It's the best way to do it. He knows it's not the best way to do it. Using an additional deformer or a different parameter for the closed mouth pucker would make more sense in the context of the tongue. But here we are. Next I'm going to add some keys to TongueOut to actually finish the animation of the tongue coming out of the mouth. Another recording mistake, select both TongueOut tip lips and TongueOut tip line, then make keys on TongueOut. I missed the line because I was tired. This was the 3rd time I recorded it, and there were still some mistakes, but less than before, so it was worth it. So add your first 2 keys to TongueOut, and then double-click the TongueOut parameter, which will allow you to add keys at specific values. I add a key at 0.1. Then I will go to the TongueOut 0 position and make the opacity of my 2 tongue tip layers, my TongueOut tip lips and my TongueOut tip line, 0. I also need to do this for the TongueOut layer. I should have also had that selected. He agrees. With the correct keys on everything except the lip line because I missed it, but you should not miss it. You should also have those keys on the lip line. When the mouth is open, the tongue will kind of just fade in and pop out. It's not the cleanest transition in the world, but the tongue goes from 0 to 1 very quickly, so it's not likely that anyone will really notice or care. As you can see on my model, with tracking, it's pretty much instantaneous, and the switch just happens, and it's fine. Our transition and mouth shapes are animated, so it is time to work on the angles. First, we will work on what the tongue looks like inside the mouth. So I'm going to go to my TongueOut tip back deformer, and we're going to add keys to the head angles and jaw open, and then remove it from the tongue in XY jaw open deformer. This is so that we can steal the keys of jaw open and the head angles from our original tongue, just to give us a solid basis to work from. We don't want to key everything that the other tongue is keyed on, because keying blend shapes from a parent to put them on a child works, but only if you don't intend to change the child very much. And I intend to change this child quite a bit, so I do not want keys on blend shapes. They will ruin my day. So don't key the blend shapes, only key jaw open and angle XY. We'll add the blend shapes manually later. So with those keys set, drag tongue out tip back out of tongue in XY jaw open. And now begins the tedious work of making sure that the back of the tongue always looks good. So with the tongue out, we are going to go to all of the angles when the jaw is open and closed and make sure that the tongue is in the right spot and that the tip of the tongue is never crunching into the back of the tongue. We always want the back of the tongue to be visible no matter what. I am also going to solo my lower lip line with the tongue so that I can see the inner tongue despite the masks, and I can make sure that the back of the tongue should always go behind the lip line. I'm not soloing the back of the tongue with the teeth because we technically have to separate it from the teeth for it to be visible all the time like we need it to be. So I ignore the teeth. Now I have made my corner and mirrored it, but the center is still going too far down. So I'm going to enable onion skin. And then when I select all of the vertices, I have the orbit showing. Your onion skin settings don't really matter as long as you have angle X selected and the correct deformer selected. You should be able to see ghost images, or in my case, I have orbits, so I can raise the deformer in the center to match the corners. And now the deformer is smooth when I'm looking up and moving the head left and right. Everything else looks pretty much good off the bat, so I don't really need to edit it too much. And I will go on to jaw closed. For the closed jaw, we want to solo the inner tongue, the tongue out, and the tongue out tip back deformer. Then we will go to all of the head angles and make sure that our tongue out matches our inner tongue shape all the time. I don't really have a specific process for this. I'm literally just eyeballing it and making it match as best I can while keeping the deformation smooth. Once that's done, we can add our keys on the mouth pucker widen blend shape and mouth shrug. And then again, just matching them to our inner tongue. Now the tip of our tongue looks very flat while the rest of our tongue is working pretty normally. So we're going to go to the mouth XY 3D tongue tip deformer. So when the head is on the side, we're just going to move it out a bit so that our tongue looks like it's sticking out of the face. Then we can summon our Apply 3D Rotation Expression menu and update the keyform. Because this is a copy of our original 3D mouth deformer, it will have all of the same settings as our old mouth deformer and will rotate correctly with the head. And now we have tongue tip depth while keeping all of the same deformation as the mouth itself. The exact position of the tongue tip will depend on your model. You'll want to go around to check all of your angles and make sure that the tongue isn't going too high when the face is turned up. If the tongue goes too high, you will reveal gaps between the bottom of your tongue and your bottom lip, and we don't want that. The tongue should stay low enough that it is always covering the bottom lip line. While I was checking my angles, I noticed that closing the mouth while the jaw was open and the head angle was up, the tongue kind of crunches over itself. The middle of the tongue goes over the back of the tongue, which we don't want to happen. So I need to add keys to the back of the tongue on mouth open to move it up. This problem doesn't appear when the head is at a flat or down angle. So I only need to adjust it when the head is at the top angles. So on the upper angles, when the jaw is open and the mouth is closed, I will move the deformer up. With the tongue soloed, I can see that it actually isn't smooth on the other angles either, so I'm just going to go around and make sure all of them stay nice and round and smooth. I probably tweak this way more than I need to, but I am what I am. Once I am done all of my tweaks, I will check the mouth with the masks turned back on. If there are no issues, I can move on to the tongue tip and fixing mouth X. Like the head angles, mouth X needs the tip of the tongue to come out further than the lips themselves. So we are going to go to the lips X pucker shrug tongue tip deformer, and on mouth X we're just going to move it further. Mirror the motion and then do the mouth open version because we have keys on mouth open and mouth X, so our mouth open X is different than our mouth closed X, and we want both to work. From this point forward, we are essentially just fixing any problems and making the tongue look better. There isn't really a specific order I'm doing this in. I'm just trying to fix any problems that I see and make the tongue look nice. I am going to disappear again and let the video play. I'm just tweaking and tweaking and tweaking, and I don't really have much commentary for it other than I'm trying to improve the overall look of the tongue or make sure that the transitions are smoother. That's all I'm doing. Once we are feeling like the tongue is done, it is time to add physics. In order to add physics, I'm going to create a new parent deformer for the tongue tip deformer. I will call it TongueOut Tip Physics. I will also consider the child keyforms to make sure that the new deformer covers all of the areas where the tongue tip deformer goes. One of the child keyforms is the reset parameter, so my deformer is bigger than it needs to be. I'm just going to shrink it to the lips and downwards because that is enough. Then add keys to tongue physics X_1 and tongue physics Y_1. And for X, we will move the deformer left and right, and for Y, we'll move the deformer up and down. When we move the deformer up for Y, we'll also make it fatter, and when we move it down, we'll make it skinnier so that we get some squash and stretch. And for X, we can also rotate it a little bit so it sways a little bit more. Make sure to turn on extended interpolation for both. For the physics 2 parameters, we actually want to key the mesh itself. So I want to go and I want to grab my TongueOut tip lips and my TongueOut tip layers, and then key both of them on the tongue physics X2 and tongue physics Y2. Then we will use the soft select brush to just select the tip vertices with a gradient going back. And for tongue physics X2, we're going to rotate it and move it over. Do the same for the other side. And then for Y down, we will pull it down and make it skinnier. And for Y up, we will pull it up and make it wider. If you wanted to make more physics parameters than just these two, you'd basically do the same thing for each parameter, but selecting less and less from the tip of the tongue. Make sure you put extended interpolation on the physics 2 parameters as well. Then we are going to go into the physics menu to add physics to this bad boy. Add a new group and call it tongue X. Add angle X and mouth X as inputs. I didn't, but you can add angle Z as well if you want the tongue to kind of follow gravity a little bit. I just didn't do it. Both of these are automatically set to position type parameters, and we will set the effectiveness of each to 50. Then add 2 pendulums, set the duration to 5, the shaking influence to 0.8, and the overall acceleration to 2. We can see the pendulum sway if we move the head around, and I like how the pendulums are moving, so I'm going to go to the output settings and add our tongue parameters. And now we get a little wiggle wiggle when we move the head. And by a little, I mean too little. We can see that the output maximum is only at like 20. The head controls 50% of the motion of the pendulum, so the output value should be at least 50. In my case, I'm going to slow down the reaction time so that the pendulums are even more wiggly wobbly. This brings our output maximum closer to 50 and looks better. It's so goopy, I love it. Once you're happy with the angle X physics, we will duplicate the physics group and call it tongue Y. Then we will change the outputs from tongue physics X_1 to tongue physics Y_1, and it recognizes that we have another Y parameter, so we hit yes to replace. Then in the input tab, we're going to change angle X to angle Y, and we're going to change mouth X to jaw open, and change the effectiveness to 25. Then we are also going to add mouth shrug with an effectiveness of 25 as well. Now when we move the head up and down, the tongue also squishes. We will check the other parameters real quick just to make sure that they are going the right direction, and jaw open is not. So I'm going to reflect that physics input, and now it looks like the tongue is following the jaw, which is exactly what we want. And mouth shrug is already correct, so we don't need to change anything there. I didn't check mouth X, so I'm going to check mouth X, and it looks adorable, so we're good. Real quick, we're also going to check the mouth open and make sure it looks fine. In this VBridger household, we support tonguing the glue. Or is it gluing the tongue? Anyway, the physics are done, so I'm going to go and make sure that my original inner tongue is turning off because I forgot to turn it off on the TongueOut parameter. So I'll add a key at 0.8 or 0.9 and then fade out the original tongue as the tongue comes out. So when the tongue is all the way out, the inner tongue is completely gone, so it never appears and creates a double tongue. Depending on how you animated your tongue, you might not even have this problem. They can coexist peacefully depending on how your model and your art works, so I left this until the end because it's not always necessary. Before we can add this to VTube Studio, we need to make sure that the tongue is on the texture sheet and that the tongue mesh isn't overlapping anything else, because the tongue tip has a lot of empty space on the mesh and we want to make sure that that isn't being filled by some other art. In my case, because I already had these layers on my model and already did the texture alignment, the mesh is over one of the irises, so I need to make sure that it's no longer like that or I will have problems. Once all the layers are on the texture correctly, you can re-export your model for VTube Studio and open it up in VTube Studio. The reason we need to export it and we can't just connect VTube Studio to Live 2D is because the TongueOut parameter doesn't exist on our old model. If you've already set up yours, then, skip ahead, but if you've been following this tutorial series, then you don't have a TongueOut parameter yet. So open up your model in VTube Studio and navigate to the parameter cards. Then we will add a new card, we will call it TongueOut. We will make the input TongueOut and the output param TongueOut. We will set the smoothing to 0 and the bottom in number to 0.5 and the top in number to 0.6. The tongue is very quick in general when it pops out, but it does like to flicker a lot, and setting the input minimum at 0.5 and the maximum at 0.6 helps to reduce that flicker. When the input is set this tight, it doesn't really matter if you have smoothing or not, to be completely fair, but I usually just set it to 0 anyway. Now, back in Live 2D, we can connect VTube Studio to Live 2D to see our tracking in real time in the editor, and then we can look for problems and correct them all within Live 2D. Off the bat, I see I have a little opacity problem with the tongue tip when it is inside the mouth. It's kind of flickering on and off, so it's probably connected to physics, so I will recheck my physics parameters while the tongue is in, and it is appearing. So blend shapes can be a little bit weird with opacity changes, and I find they almost always have a problem, so I'm going to my blend shape and I am changing the opacity down to 0 for all of the TongueOut 0 keys to make sure that it is transparent when the tongue is not supposed to be out. And going back to the physics window, I can see that the tongue is now not appearing when it's not supposed to, which is good. While sticking the tongue out is cute and all, it can be cuter. So I'm going to add another input to the tongue Y physics. First, I'll reduce the effectiveness of angle Y to 30 instead of 50 because I need to have more effectiveness that I can use for my new parameter. And I'm going to make that input tongue out. Now when I stick my tongue out, it squishes, which is 100 times cuter than when it doesn't squish. Amazing, it looks awesome. Now I'm going to show you the problem that happens if you don't do pucker widen when you're supposed to, which I didn't. Remember when I told you that I had forgotten to do pucker widen until way later in the video? This is what it looks like if you forget to do pucker widen. The tongue will cut through the lip, and I could not for the life of me figure out why. For a long time, longer than it had any right to elude me. And, yeah, it was just that I forgot pucker widen way back. So, if you do pucker widen correctly, you should not have this problem. If you have this problem, it is probably because you skipped pucker widen. This is the part of the recording that I stole the pucker widen footage from. When pucker widen is working correctly, you will not have the tongue cutting through the lip. Technically, the simplest version of the tongue is now done! Yay! Let's party. You should be able to stick your tongue out and never have it break unless the tracking itself breaks. The rest of this video is about adding multiple layers to the tongue. So if you're just making a simple tongue, proceed no further for your own sanity, and if you're crazy enough to want to do multiple layers to your tongue, enjoy. I will take this opportunity to remind you of the layers I am using for this example. You can technically use as many layers as you'd like though. The important thing to remember is to always use inverse masks, and your inverse mask for your tongue tip needs to be filled in because it is an inverse mask instead of deleting the top part of it. In order to make the extra layers for the tongue, we are going to be copying the glue and the layers that we've already done, and then replacing the art. This means that we don't need to re-glue anything, and we don't need to go through a bunch of extra pain for no reason. To get started in Live 2D, we will import our PSD, and then we are going to delete the original layers for all of the other tongue layers. In order to get all of the layers that we need, I'm going to select the glue and hit Ctrl+C. This will automatically select all of the layers involved, allowing us to make a perfect copy of all the glued objects. Then we need to paste for as many layers as we have for our tongue. In my case, I have the shadow layer and the shine layer and the mask layer. So I'm going to paste 3 times. All of the copies are just numbered, so I'm going to replace the numbers with which layer they should correspond to. 2 becomes _shadow, so all of my copies that have 2 after them are for the shadow layer. All of my copies with 3 after them become the highlight layer, and all my copies with 4 after them become the mask layer. Once everything is renamed, you're going to want to take your tongue out base layer, so the layer that isn't cut at all, that's just the full tongue, and make sure all of those end up back inside the mouth under the top teeth where they belong. Everything is kind of where we need it to be now, so we're going to go to the Project tab and find our PSD and our model image list. This list is in chronological order, so if you import new layers, they end up on the bottom. So all my additional tongue layers are on the bottom there. In order to replace the art of any art mesh, you need to select that art mesh, and then you can right-click on one of the model images and then set as input image of selected art mesh. You can see that the tiny layer icon has changed to our shadow layer now instead of our solid tongue layer. So I'll go to each base tongue layer and replace it with our new layers. You can replace the art of multiple art meshes at once, so for all of the TongueOut tip layers, I can select both shadow layers and replace both their art at the same time, so I do that for all of the tongue tip layers. The mesh for our tongue layers isn't always as big as we need it to be, so for the TongueOut shadow and the TongueOut mask, both of these are bigger than our original tongue, and the mesh doesn't cover everything that we need it to cover. It is pretty easy to adjust this though. All we need to do is select all of the mask layers, go into mesh edit mode, and then we just scale the mesh up. Then I am going to delete the inside mesh of the mask layer. Then I'll select my TongueOut layer and copy its mesh. Going to all of the TongueOut mask layers, I will paste the mesh. Next, I will select just the TongueOut layer and then the TongueOut mask layer and go into edit mode and glue them together where they share mesh in the middle. I'll select the glue and paint the whole thing red. This means that the outside of the mask layer sticks to the other masks, keeping the outside edge working the same way our base tongue does so we can control it, while the inside stays glued to the original layer. This means that we can animate physics or change the base layer and the mask will follow it, and we only need to worry about the outer edge of the mask for the mask itself. Next, I'll glue my TongueOut tip lips and my TongueOut tip lips mask layers together and paint the glue red. So just the same thing that we did to the base of the tongue, but to the tip of the tongue. The final mask layer for the TongueOut tip doesn't actually need to be glued because we only need it to control the edge of the glue on the tip of the tongue, and the mask for the TongueOut lips already will be masking the tongue itself, so we don't need to glue the tip. Next, we need to deal with the shadow layer. For the shadow layer, I'm going to roughly add new vertices around the edges, trying to make them in line with the existing mesh. We'll need to manually adjust these sadly, but we can mostly follow the existing glue as a guide and it won't be too hard. In order to quickly and easily select two meshes that are glued together, select the glue and hit Ctrl+C. It will automatically select the meshes and you can just enter edit mode to select the new verts and glue them together. So glue the extra verts we added together for each shadow layer, then use the tongue reset parameter to make sure the vertices align with the old glue. Be careful not to edit the old glue at all or your layers won't be correctly aligned with their counterparts anymore. Change the shadow layers to multiply and then add the tip mask to the tip shadow and tip highlight layers and the tongue out mask to the tongue out shadow and tongue out highlight layers. Then select all the mask layers and use multiple key editing to ensure that they are always transparent. If you want, you can leave the reset key out of the multiple key edit so that they stay 100% when reset's turned on if you want to see them when you reset everything. Up to you. You can now select each set of layers, for example, all of the shadow layers, and add keys to angle X, Y, and animate them to add some depth to the tongue. Just remember that we already have physics keys and keys on the tongue out parameter, so make sure that any changes work with the physics. The tongue will probably be out when you're animating it, so you don't need to worry about the tongue out parameter. We mostly want to make sure that the physics don't cause any layer edges to show up where we don't want them. I'll leave this section as a time lapse. Your individual way of animating the tongue layers might be different, and you can see what I'm doing if you want to do something similar, but it's pretty self-explanatory. Lastly, while doing some checks, we see our tongue has gotten cut off by a mask. This is the upper lip mask. When the mouth is on the side using mouth X and physics are activated, the tongue goes behind the upper lip mask. We can actually just move the upper lip mask edges up because they are way overlapping the bottom lip mask already, or you can just move up each side as the mouth X happens. Up to you. As long as they're up and out of the way so they don't cut off the tongue, we're good. The cut tends to only happen on mouth X, so I'll add keys to mouth X and move the mask up so it never cuts off the tongue when physics and mouth X are activated. With that, our tongue should be done. Our advanced tongue, our base tongue, all of the tongues. So many tongues. Too many tongues. Thank you for watching. I'm sure this method can be pushed further, so I look forward to seeing what everybody does with it. Tongues are still absolute pain, but this method at least makes the VBridger tongue and more 3D tongues possible, so it's pretty fun. This was the final part of the 2024 VBridger rigging tutorial series. I know it's 2025 when this actually gets released, but technically most of it was made in 2024, so it counts. Thank you for watching, and I hope these tutorials have helped. If you want more assistance, there is a rigging forum in the VBridger Discord, which you can access via the VBridger app.